Mexico City, in our work at the LSE, we refer to it as the endless city. You don't know where it stops. You don't know where it starts. But the problem is not just there. The problem is very much in the North American world, where this sort of development, I took this picture 3 years ago, I couldn't believe that that is actually what's still happening in Dallas, Texas, in the 21st century, under current concerns about the environment and everything else. And I think that's a challenge to you here in Colombia. How do you actually change this mentality? This is what's happening in Lagos. I don't need to show you what's going to happen next. You all know what this development is going to be and how car dependent it's going to be, and probably not enough density to make it work. Because different cities have actually dealt with these issues of change in very, very different ways and very efficiently. And one of the best, of course, is Singapore. Highly planned, centralized city-state with a very, very strong regime, which, even though it's grown in population over the years, has actually maintained its density and its footprint very, very well. Now, if you don't do that, if you allow cities to sprawl, you increase commuting, you increase social exclusion, and we'll come back to that, but you also create the environmental impacts that could be anywhere in the world. In that picture of New Delhi, today, when you have extremes of environmental pollution, it's the equivalent, just by opening your window, of smoking 1 pack of cigarettes a day, without doing anything else. Those are sort of the issues that are happening. And these situations have made worse. This is a very European concern now. Refugees coming from Africa, from other parts of the world, i.e. man-made disasters, as well as environmental disasters, which are pouring more and more people into cities. And where do they end up? And this is central to the question of exclusion. In those fragile areas, underserviced, either at the center of the city, like Mumbai or Sao Paulo, or very often, as in the case of Bogota, pushed out towards the edges. These 3 maps, which you don't need to look at in detail, show in the darker green where the most excluded members of society live. Now, every city has this. London is different, and I'll come back to that in a moment, but Rio de Janeiro has the whole of the west side, the darker green, where most of the deprived people live. Hong Kong is itself different. The challenge for all of us here is, how do we recognize, that's why I say data is important, where exclusion is actually concentrated, and how can we plan to improve those networks of social services, of provision of schools, of health, and much more, to distribute and not ghettoize those exclusive neighborhoods, as has been happening. Of course, this became absolutely clear during COVID. I'm not sure what it was like in your cities here, but certainly in New York or London, the concentration of higher death rates and the concentration of the spread of the disease was in all those areas which for years have been the most deprived, the most excluded, highest unemployment, concentration of people of different ethnicities and race. Now, remember that in the UK, as in other parts of Europe and the world, mayors can be re-elected for more than 1 term. That makes a difference. But significantly, none of them are going to last 25 years. So the idea is to set long-term visions for investments in transport and other important issues, which I'll come to. So this was the London plan set by Ken Livingstone in 2004. It does 3 things, very, very simple. 1, it reinforces that black line of the Greenbelt. London cannot grow beyond those limits. It is illegal to build there, and that gets enforced. 2, where there are areas, and it was referred to as brownfield sites, ex-industrial sites, areas with capacity, build more. Get the planners locally to allow more housing, more development to happen, but only if, this is number 3, there's good public transport. In other words, don't allow it if it's car dependent, because obviously that has a negative impact on the ecology of the city as a whole. That is a London plan which has led actually the thinking of now 3 different mayors. And we couldn't have 3 more different mayors, I can assure you, from that. And the current London plan, the one passed by Sadiq Khan, very much allows and proposes the same ideas of what we call densification and not allowing the green belt to expand. All new building and housing has to happen within the city limits, and particularly where there is good public transport. Central to this is housing. Maybe we can talk about that in a moment. But clearly, the fact that there's now a mayor who requires that any new development has between 30 and 50% affordable housing makes an enormous difference to where it is. But you need, and I stress, this bigger vision of where the city is going. It has to have agreement and alignment with regional and national planning for it to be implemented. Otherwise, very few of these initiatives will happen. At a more local level, the Mayor of London has implemented a number of important changes in terms of traffic congestion and taxation, effectively, in terms of using cars, and increase the investment in public transport and much else. The result of all this has ended up with significant expansion of London to the poorer east. You remember the concentration of redder areas in that MRI scan that I talked about before. And one of the biggest investments, which is only opened a few months ago, at that point opened by Queen Elizabeth, she was still alive, and you can see a picture there, cuts across the whole of London, partly underground and partly above ground, to connect some of those more deprived areas with less access to jobs to the rest of London. The result of this policy is there to see. If you go into central London, the city of London, the area where 98% of people use public transport to get to work, that's what it's looking like. It may not be the obvious memory all of you have of this relatively low-density, gentle city. And this is where I want to turn in the last 10 minutes to the two projects, which I think focus essentially on this question of inclusion, but also through design of public space. I think for any of you in the room here, in one way or other, whatever investment you make, whether it's a massive office block or it's a housing program, or whether you're someone who deals with investment or policy, the spaces outside the building are just as important, or may one say, even more important. And where did I learn this? From Joan Clos, sitting right here, and his colleagues in Barcelona, because the whole city has been designed from the 19th century on around the spaces in between the building, allowing buildings to change and adapt and respond to current needs. But I think that is an essential idea. Flexibility, quality of public space is central to questions of inclusion.
En una conversación previa hablábamos de la pandemia y cómo la pandemia nos cambió tantas cosas en la vida y también cambia la construcción y las necesidades y los servicios que hay que proveer. Hablábamos con Ricky de los temas digitales y una paradoja que produjo la pandemia. Nos digitalizó mucho más, pero al mismo tiempo nos hizo sentir más urgencia de abrazar a los otros, de compartir, de podernos encontrar con los demás.
Not in England.
¿Cómo? Hasta ahí llegó la pregunta. ¿Cómo resolver, Ricky, esa doble dimensión? Que somos más digitales, pero nos queremos abrazar más y queremos compartir más un parque y queremos estar más en el espacio público.
I touched upon some research we've just done, and that will be available in a few weeks from now in a new publication, where we've been tracking, you saw, the trends both in remote working and remote shopping and online shopping. And that has been happening for 15, 20 years. That trend has continued. In some cases, some cities and some cultures, urban cultures, have bounced back towards, if I use the scale that you used, I like it. There's that more hugging rather than less hugging, right? some cities have actually realized how important it was to have that physical, visual connection and invested in that. So, for example, the city of Lisbon in Portugal has totally changed its policies since the pandemic to attract digital nomads. Digital nomads. In other words, young people who are able to, in a way, work anywhere. And they've facilitated that, even at the level of national government through visas, but also by providing buildings, subsidized buildings in city central areas to, in a way, adapt to this change. So I wouldn't be so black and white as your question implies. You know, are we humans who like contact, are we, or not? The answer is that in itself, and I'm not joking when I say the UK, well actually not the UK, England as opposed to Scotland, for example, is very different when it comes to physical contact. We had someone from Sweden make a presentation at the London School of Economics last week who said that their notion of the herd immunity for the vaccine in Sweden was natural because the Swedes don't like being together in public space. You know, so it's a different way of being as you are in those of us, you know, more Latin countries in that connection. So I would have thought the key challenge, and therefore even for me an opportunity, is to combine those two. For example, aging populations, people above 60, in European cities or of course in parts of Asia, can benefit enormously from the digital as a way of reinforcing their day-to-day connections. The city of Barcelona a few years ago invented a system which is designed around bringing the digital to help older people not feel isolated. So I think it's not that simplistic.
Muchas gracias, Ricky.